actually am an introvert. So whenever I go to a party, I prefer to simply slip away than all the messy goodbyes that have to take place. So I was tempted just to slip away. That is, just to preach a regular old sermon and pretend that none of this is happening. My capacity for denial is quite good. And goodness knows there were plenty of things for me to preach about this week, like health care, that proposal that would take away insurance from millions of people, mostly the working poor, and would allow companies to cover people who have existing conditions without covering the existing condition. Or I could have preached about how we have treated and abused Mother Earth and now are reaping the terrible harvest of that abuse. We could struggle together to try to find meaning out of so many of the catastrophes that have struck our planet in recent days. Or I could have talked about how we have created a culture which responds to our fear with anger and violence, creating a result where an intoxicated Georgia Tech student is shot to death holding a tool in his hand. Or I could have talked about how our current culture of deregulating greed can lead to a dozen deaths in a for-profit nursing home. Sermons on any of these topics would have been congruent with who we are and appropriate for this day. Frankly, talking about those things would be much easier than saying goodbye. I don't know about you, but for me, anger feels much better than sorrow. So my other strategy for this Sunday was to talk about all that we have accomplished together over the last 6.5 years. And again, there is plenty to talk about. Before I came here, before most of you started attending here, the associate conference minister of this conference recommended strongly that this church be closed. And when I arrived, the average attendance was 26 on Sundays. The church couldn't really afford a pastor, and so for the first 4 years that I was here, my tithe was greater than my salary. The building that we are in was in terrible condition. The windows about to fall out, the steeple about to fall off, and an air conditioner that gave up the ghost shortly after my first summer here. But we found a way to restore this building. And now we are in the process of making it accessible to all. We've already redone the plaza out front and dedicated it in honor of Miss Blanche and in memory of her sister Dorothy. This church also revised its governing documents, reducing our bylaws from 27 pages to 7. Now that may not sound like much of an accomplishment, but as someone who consults with churches all over the country, I can tell you there are hundreds of churches that are being choked to death by all of their rules, but are too afraid to change them. Not you. We adopted a new vision based on Micah 6:8, and we have been faithful in fulfilling that mission. It is tempting for a church to try to do everything and be all things to all people. But we adopted a vision that defined us, and we are okay with some of the things we aren't. One of the core values we have lived into in this place that I am most proud of is our commitment to diversity. Now, church growth principles teach that the more homogeneous a congregation is, the more rapidly it grows. Being diverse is a challenge, and we might have grown a lot more and a lot faster if we had not been committed to inclusive language, to multicultural music and images, to progressive theology that welcomes everyone. But that is what makes this place special. And I, for one, hope it never changes. In fulfillment of our governing philosophy and of becoming a permission-giving church, when David Gillespie, who was just a church member at the time, came to us and asked if the church would be willing to help him work with some of his friends who were homeless, we instantly said yes. We didn't need to vote on it. We already had when we adopted our mission and vision and said, yes, this is who we are. None of us, including David, had any idea what this ministry would look like. But if you were here last Sunday, then you know the scope of how far-reaching our homeless ministry really is. So moving was it that a donor in Texas, reading about our work, and David's in particular, with the homeless, gave us $1 million to do this work. This small church now has an outsized ministry that resulted 100% in us being clear about our vision and our mission and our core values. Let me say, as a side note, that living in one of the richest neighborhoods in the Southeast, having a homeless ministry is not the most popular thing. It is not universally supported by all of our neighbors. And if I might say, the leading candidate for mayor, Mary Norwood, said on radio this week that the homeless were bad neighbors and should be swept out of sight. I am not saying to you, don't vote for Mary Norwood, but I am saying to you that between now and the election, educate her. Enlighten her about what it means to follow a homeless rabbi from Galilee. I am deeply grateful to David Gillespie and to Reverend Claudia for the work they do on our behalf among the homeless. And I am deeply grateful to both of them for helping us do that work too. We all should be working for the least of God's children, because that is how we serve Jesus. And over the past 6.5 years, as you saw, we have relaunched a very effective children's ministry, a small group program, a glorious music program, thanks to Randy and all of you. We have done so much in this space. And while I could talk the rest of the day of all the things I am proud of around here, let me say that Sunday mornings here are amazing. I leave here every Sunday morning grateful to be here and not wanting to be anywhere else, saying to David or to Bill or to anyone who will listen, I don't think it gets any better than this. That is thanks to so many of you. Jeff Ayers has been our ever faithful worship coordinator. Mark and Philip run multimedia up in the balcony. And David Plunkett, he is the genius who creates this multimedia and the person who is so OCD that it is perfect every Sunday. And I travel all over the country teaching other churches to do what we do. In fact, this coming Saturday, I will spend 8 hours teaching 10 people from 10 different churches how to do worship like this in Cleveland, Ohio. There is one last person I must thank and acknowledge for contributing probably most to the renewal of the Virginia-Highland Church, for helping us be who we are. As you might imagine, as the pastor, I get here early on Sunday mornings before most anybody else. Occasionally, Randy and I tie for that. But because I got here so early, he came with me and came into this room and cleaned every pew, made sure there were envelopes and pens in every one of them. Today, Chris Harris does that on his behalf. Bill was the entire hospitality team when we arrived. He bought fair trade coffee and bought refreshments. He left during communion every Sunday and went out there and started the coffee for us, took the refreshments out and put them on the table, and then after everyone was gone, he cleaned up afterwards. Now, Nancy and her hospitality team do a beautiful job of that, and if you'll stick around for lunch afterwards, they'll show you how glorious their work is. Bill fixed communion every Sunday. Not just fixed it, he bought the wine, and he bought the bread, and he cut it up, and he set it up. He took the communion ware home and polished it. He took the cloths home and washed and ironed them. Now, Jeff has half a dozen folks who faithfully do that every Sunday. And if you've joined this church since I've been here, in all probability, Bill taught your membership class. He printed all the material, he bought lunch, set up the tables, and even gave away $50 of his own money as an illustration of generosity. When we first started small groups, Bill was the one who wrote all of the curriculum for those small groups, and the most popular of them all was his small group called Wine and Word. He was our chief greeter, and before Jim and Deb started ushering, he was the one who handed bulletins to everyone when they arrived. He learned everybody's name and made sure everyone felt welcome in this place. I get most of the credit for this church being 5 or 6 or today 10 times bigger than it was when I arrived. But the saint who did the most was Bill Ure. And you are his living legacy. We are still working on new altar and pulpit furniture, which we will have dedicate in his honor, and I hope you'll let me come back when you do that. We've accomplished so much in the past 6.5 years, and I am proud of who we have become. I hope you pick a good pastor, because years from now, when I return to Georgia, I want this to be my church. So do a good job selecting my successor. So I could have talked about all those things in my final sermon, but as I pondered this valedictory moment, I considered talking about famous last words. The epistle lesson that you heard this morning was written by St. Paul from prison. His last words, commending people and saying, God isn't finished with you yet. The gospel lesson from John 14 was Jesus' last sermon to his disciples. And he assures them he's not going to leave them as orphans, but the Spirit will be present with them. And that will be enough. And isn't that what we all need to remember today? I have every confidence that the Spirit has been with you, is with you, and will be with you. And so our future is in very good hands. In the early church, when you became a Christian, you took your life in your own hands. You could be killed by the Romans. So when early Christians parted, they didn't say goodbye. But thinking about the resurrection, they said, I'll see you in the morning. So, as a church that has literally been resurrected right before our very eyes, this isn't goodbye, but I will see you in the morning. The famous last words that I want to leave with you are the last words that Bill and I said to each other every single night for more than 36 years. On the last night of his life, I didn't say goodbye, and I didn't say good night. I said the last words that I would like to leave with you. I said to him, I love you. And that's what he said to me. And I always will, from now until the finale. Amen.